the Soviet bioweapons lab in Vozrozhdeniya Island. Far away from the familiar landscapes of civilization, hidden deep within the desolate waters of the Aral Sea, there once stood a place so secretive, so isolated, that for decades it didn't appear on any public maps. Vozrozhdeniya Island, or Rebirth Island, as it was called, became the stage for one of the most chilling chapters in the history of biological warfare. For much of the Cold War, it was a forbidden zone, where nature was reshaped into something far more sinister. It was the 1950s when the Soviet government, locked in a silent arms race with the West, chose this barren island for a purpose unlike any other. Its isolation made it perfect. With miles of empty water surrounding it, there would be no accidental witnesses, no curious onlookers, no escape. What they built there was a laboratory and testing ground for the world's most dangerous biological weapons, lethal pathogens that could wipe out entire populations if unleashed. Inside those concrete walls, shielded from the world, Soviet scientists worked relentlessly on weaponizing some of the deadliest diseases known to man. Anthrax, plague, smallpox, brucellosis, tularemia. Their names alone evoke dread. But here, they were cultivated, enhanced, and tested to be deadlier, faster, and resistant to existing treatments. It is said that new strains were engineered to survive in harsh environments, remain contagious longer, and defy antibiotics. But Vozrozhdeniya was more than just a lab, it was a place of field testing. The island saw live experiments, where deadly agents were released into the environment to study their spread and potency. Small animals like monkeys, rabbits, and guinea pigs were placed in steel cages, exposed to the pathogens and observed. The fates of these creatures remain grim footnotes in the island's forgotten history. As decades passed, the laboratory expanded. Underground bunkers, decontamination zones, and storage facilities filled the landscape. It was a self-contained world of science twisted for war. Few people outside the Soviet defense structure even knew it existed. Even the scientists who worked there were sworn to silence, living in isolated barracks with their lives consumed by classified projects. Then came the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. The empire that had funded Vozrozhdeniya for decades fell apart seemingly overnight. Budgets dried up, priorities shifted, and suddenly, this secretive island was no longer anyone's responsibility. The staff left, the labs were sealed, or so it was thought, and Vozrozhdeniya was abandoned. But what they left behind was far from harmless. Years later, in the early 2000s, international teams of scientists and military personnel began visiting the island, now technically part of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. What they found was deeply disturbing. Entire buildings stood in eerie silence, their walls peeling, their equipment rusted but still standing like frozen snapshots of the Cold War. In locked freezers and storage rooms, they discovered thousands of vials containing live anthrax spores. Some were labeled, many were not. The mere presence of these biological agents posed an unimaginable risk. Anthrax spores are incredibly resilient and can survive for decades in the soil or air, waiting to be inhaled or ingested. Elsewhere, personal protective equipment, now brittle with age, lay scattered across floors and countertops. Gas masks, chemical suits, syringes, and lab notes. Everything was left in haste, as if those who fled the island knew they would never return. Maps and handwritten documents described testing areas, infection rates, and decontamination procedures. Faded warning signs in Russian warned of lethal zones and prohibited areas. But perhaps the most haunting sight was not the equipment itself, but the lingering presence of what once occurred there. In the open fields beyond the lab buildings, rusted animal cages still sat where they had been placed decades before. Their occupants long gone, the cages stood as silent witnesses to the suffering and sacrifice of countless test subjects, forgotten by history. Environmental tests conducted on the island's soil revealed shocking results. Large portions of Vozrozhdeniya were heavily contaminated with anthrax spores and other biological agents. Worse, some of these pathogens had likely leaked into the environment over time, carried by wind and water, creating an invisible hazard for any who might venture too close. Recognizing the threat, the United States and Uzbekistan launched a joint effort in 2002 to decontaminate the island. American military contractors, alongside Uzbek forces, worked to neutralize the most dangerous stockpiles. They burned contaminated soil, sealed off hazardous areas, and destroyed remaining vials of pathogens. The cleanup was extensive, but many believe it was incomplete. Even today, access to Vozrozhdeniya remains restricted, though the island itself has undergone a strange transformation. Due to the shrinking of the Aral Sea, what was once an island has now become connected to the mainland. Wildlife has slowly begun to return. Wild boars, birds, and desert foxes roam among the ruins, perhaps unaware of the invisible dangers lingering beneath the ground. What bacteria or mutated strains they might carry into the surrounding regions is unknown. And there remains a deeper mystery. How much of the Soviet Union's bioweapons research was truly destroyed? Were all the samples found? Or do some still remain, buried deep within sealed bunkers, waiting to be uncovered by time or human curiosity? Official reports claim the worst threats have been neutralized, but with a place so shrouded in secrecy, certainty is impossible. Vozrozhdeniya Island stands today as a forgotten monument to humanity's darkest ambitions. It is a place where science, driven by fear and competition, crossed the line into horror. And though the island is now silent, the echoes of what happened there linger still, carried on the desert winds and whispered by the rusting ruins of the past. The Henderson Lab Freezers, Nevada, USA. In the quiet outskirts of Henderson, Nevada, where the scorching desert sun meets forgotten industrial zones, there once stood a small laboratory. By outward appearance, it was unremarkable. A squat, concrete building, weather-worn and surrounded by a rusting chain-link fence. To passers-by, it looked like a forgotten warehouse, long closed and lost to the sands of time. But within its cold, shadowed walls, something far stranger and far darker had been left behind. The Henderson Laboratory began as a privately owned research facility sometime in the 1970s. Its founder, a reclusive biologist whose name has since faded from public memory, specialized in experimental veterinary science. At first, the lab's work was mundane, developing vaccines for livestock diseases, studying parasites, and improving feed additives for local ranchers. But as the years went by, the research took a strange and secretive turn. Local whispers spoke of animals being trucked in during the dead of night, creatures not native to Nevada's desert, some rumored to be exotic species brought from far-off continents. Employees came and went, bound by strict non-disclosure agreements. Some neighbors claimed they heard unsettling animal cries echoing through the desert winds at night, although no one could say exactly what was happening within those walls. Then, sometime in the late 1990s, the laboratory abruptly closed. No press release, no bankruptcy filing, no public record of its dissolution. The employees disappeared as silently as they had come, and the building was left to rot under the relentless Nevada sun. For years, it sat there sealed and forgotten. It wasn't until over a decade later, when urban explorers stumbled upon the decaying structure, that its secrets began to surface. The explorers entered through a broken side door, their footsteps echoing through long-abandoned corridors. What they found inside was far from the empty rooms they expected. Much of the laboratory's equipment remained intact, covered in dust and cobwebs but still standing like relics of a lost time. Test tubes, centrifuges, microscopes, and faded lab notebooks lay scattered across the counters. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In the back of the facility, down a dark hallway lined with peeling biohazard warnings, they found the freezer rooms. Industrial walk-in freezers, still sealed shut. After forcing open the rusted latches, they were met with an icy fog, spilling out like breath from the mouth of the building itself. Inside, rows of metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, lined with hundreds of sealed containers, each one meticulously labeled with cryptic codes and scientific terms. What they contained turned their exploration into something far more unsettling. There were animal organs, hearts, brains, lungs, preserved in a frozen stasis. Samples of tissue sliced thin and stored between glass plates. Whole animals, small and strange, curled into fetal positions inside thick plastic bags. Some creatures appeared normal. Rabbits, mice, birds, but others were harder to identify. There were malformed specimens, animals with extra limbs, twisted spines, or grotesquely enlarged features, as if mid-experiment when they were frozen. Perhaps the most chilling find was a series of jars containing what appeared to be fetuses of indeterminate species, some resembling common mammals, others unlike anything the explorers could easily recognize. The labels on these jars were faded, written in scientific shorthand that no outsider could easily decode. The room was silent, save for the hum of a single generator still running, powered by a decades-old backup system, maintaining the freezers at their freezing temperatures all these years. No one knew how much longer it would last. Word of the discovery eventually reached local authorities and scientific experts. When they entered the lab officially, what they found confirmed the explorers' worst fears. Many of the frozen specimens were not just animal tissues but experimental hybrids, cross-species grafts, and artificially altered embryos. It appeared that the Henderson lab had been experimenting with genetic manipulation long before such practices became mainstream or regulated. The exact purpose of these experiments remains unclear to this day. Some documents suggested the lab was attempting to create disease-resistant livestock or studying genetic mutations for pharmaceutical purposes. But other notes hinted at far more ethically questionable goals: splicing genes from different species, pushing the boundaries of biological possibility, perhaps for military or commercial gain. As the investigation continued, authorities faced a difficult question: what to do with the contents of the freezers? Some samples were potentially biohazardous, others posed unknown risks. Ultimately, the decision was made to incinerate the biological materials in a controlled facility to prevent any possible contamination or unauthorized study. But the story doesn't end there. Some urban legends claim that not all the freezers were cleared, that, deep within the building's labyrinthine lower levels, there remain sealed chambers, perhaps inaccessible due to structural collapse, where other experiments still wait in their icy tombs. Others say that a few of the more unusual specimens were quietly removed before the authorities arrived, spirited away by unknown collectors or rogue scientists, eager to study what mainstream science had abandoned. Today, the Henderson lab stands in ruins, its roof partially collapsed, its walls covered in graffiti and sandblasted by desert winds. But the air around it feels heavy, as if the building itself remembers the things it once held. Local hikers avoid the site, claiming the atmosphere feels wrong, like being watched from within. No official records list the names of the scientists who worked there. No company claims ownership of the property. It is as if the entire lab and its dark legacy has been erased from history. But the explorers who first found it, and the rare photos that surfaced online, keep the memory alive. They remind us that sometimes the most unsettling discoveries are not lost civilizations or ancient artifacts, but the forgotten ambitions of human science, left behind in locked freezers, waiting to be found again. The Chernobyl Pripyat Laboratories. In the heart of northern Ukraine, nestled among the skeletal remains of the ghost city of Pripyat, lies one of the world's most unsettling relics of scientific ambition turned disaster. Hidden behind rusting doors and cracked concrete walls, the abandoned laboratories of Pripyat remain frozen in time, their shelves still lined with forgotten experiments, their rooms silent save for the slow decay of what was once cutting-edge research. These labs, once humming with activity, now stand as eerie monuments to a tragedy that forever changed the course of human history. The laboratories of Pripyat were established in the late 1970s to serve the growing scientific needs of the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant. They housed teams of physicists, chemists, and biologists working to monitor radiation levels, test environmental safety, and explore the possibilities of nuclear energy. Some projects were purely practical: soil samples, water purification studies, and radiation shielding experiments. But others, it is said, delved into more obscure areas: mutagenesis, radiobiology, and the strange effects of ionizing radiation on living tissue. Then came the night of April 26, 1986. The explosion of reactor number 4 turned Pripyat from a thriving Soviet city into a silent graveyard. Radiation levels skyrocketed. Emergency evacuations cleared the streets within days, leaving homes, schools, and laboratories abandoned, their inhabitants fleeing with only what they could carry. The labs were no exception. Experiments were left unfinished, glass beakers mid-reaction, notebooks open to hastily scribbled calculations. The researchers, those who survived, never returned. For years, the laboratories remained untouched, sealed away by lethal radiation and the strict no-entry zones surrounding the exclusion zone. But time, as always, eroded the barriers. By the 1990s and 2000s, daring explorers, scientists, journalists, and urban adventurers began to slip through the quarantine, their curiosity greater than their fear. What they found inside was chilling. In one laboratory basement, researchers discovered rows of glass jars filled with preserved biological specimens. Frogs with misshapen limbs, fish with two heads, and insects swollen to unnatural sizes floated in murky preservatives. These were not the products of Chernobyl's radiation, but part of the lab's early radiation studies. Creatures deliberately exposed to low levels of radiation to study genetic mutation. Ironically, the uncontrolled disaster of 1986 would dwarf these controlled experiments in both scale and horror. Elsewhere, radiation suits and gas masks were stacked against the walls, coated in thick layers of radioactive dust. The faded logos of the Soviet Union adorned some of the equipment, their once proud symbols now ghostly reminders of a fallen regime. Clipboards with monitoring data from the days before and after the explosion lay scattered across tables, their ink smudged by humidity but still legible. They documented rising radiation levels, emergency response plans, and calculations that likely came too late to prevent disaster. Perhaps most unsettling were the handwritten notes found in several of the labs. Among them were logs detailing radiation exposure tests not just on plants and animals, but allegedly on human tissue samples. There is no clear evidence these were unethical experiments. Most likely, they were post-mortem studies of contaminated victims, but the mere presence of such records in this abandoned place sent a chill down the spines of those who found them. The labs themselves were decaying monuments. Cracked tiles, rusted steel tables, and collapsed ceilings created an atmosphere of apocalyptic decay. Vines crept through shattered windows, while puddles of rainwater reflected the crumbling remnants of Soviet science. And yet, amidst the ruin, dangerous remnants still lingered. Some laboratory samples remained highly radioactive. Open petri dishes, broken vials, and soil specimens taken from the Red Forest, one of the most irradiated places on Earth, sat exposed on countertops. Radiation meters clicked rapidly when explorers approached these relics, warning of the invisible danger that still filled the air. In a separate wing of the research complex, old computers from the 1980s sat frozen in time. Their screens long dark, but their floppy disks and paper punch cards still preserved. What secrets might be hidden in that lost data? Environmental records? Genetic experiments? Or merely the mundane calculations of nuclear physics? No one knows for certain, as the risk of contamination prevented any serious recovery effort. But it was not just the biological labs that caused unease. A physics laboratory nearby, believed to have been part of the plant's radiation control division, contained strange, half-completed shielding experiments. Large slabs of lead and graphite sat stacked next to radiation emitters, as though some final test had been planned but never carried out. The room felt as though its occupants might return at any moment to finish what they had started. Today, the Chernobyl laboratories stand as eerie time capsules. Technically, they are within the still restricted exclusion zone, though monitoring levels have fallen low enough in some areas to allow short-term exploration. Wildlife has reclaimed much of Pripyat, with wild dogs, boars, and even deer roaming the empty streets and hallways. Yet the laboratories remain silent, as though untouched by the new life outside. There is something profoundly unsettling about these spaces. Unlike natural disasters or war-torn ruins, these laboratories were abandoned not because of external destruction, but because of an invisible threat, the kind of danger that cannot be seen, smelled, or touched, but that lingers all the same. Radiation remains a silent killer, and in these rooms, it hangs in the air like an unseen ghost. And there are still rumors. Some claim that deeper within Pripyat's industrial zones, beyond the reach of most explorers, there are hidden rooms sealed before the evacuation. Rooms containing highly classified projects. Secret experiments never publicly disclosed, rumored to have explored the weaponization of radiation not just as an energy source but as a tool of genetic manipulation. Whether these stories are fact or folklore, no one can say. Few are brave or foolish enough to seek them out. The laboratories of Pripyat remain as they were left nearly 40 years ago. Silent, decaying, and filled with forgotten science. They remind us of the thin line between curiosity and catastrophe, and how even the most advanced knowledge can be swept away by a single moment of human error. And as the wind whispers through the shattered glass and empty corridors of Pripyat, the laboratories wait. For what no one knows. Unit 731 facilities, Harbin, China. Hidden in the frozen outskirts of Harbin, beneath the cold skies of northeastern China, lies the decaying remains of one of history's most horrifying scientific complexes. Here, surrounded by forests and icy winds, the ruins of Unit 731 tell a story of science turned monstrous, of curiosity consumed by cruelty. Unlike most abandoned laboratories, where experiments were conducted on cells and microbes, the walls of Unit 731 once witnessed something far darker, the deliberate suffering of human beings in the name of progress. Unit 731 began its operations in 1936, under the secretive guidance of the Imperial Japanese Army. Officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, its innocent title masked a terrifying reality. Behind its gates, Japanese scientists and military officers conducted gruesome biological and chemical experiments on thousands of prisoners. Chinese civilians, Russian captives, and Allied prisoners of war. These people, stripped of their names and identities, became mere subjects in a nightmarish pursuit of knowledge. The facility itself was vast. Sprawling barracks, sealed laboratories, crematoriums, dissection chambers, and underground bunkers stretched across the frozen landscape. Hidden from the world's view, it was a city of cruelty where entire wings were dedicated to the cultivation of plague bacteria, anthrax spores, cholera cultures, and more. Scientists raised colonies of fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, intending to release them upon enemy populations. But the most horrifying chapters of Unit 731's history took place not in petri dishes, but on living subjects. Prisoners were exposed to extreme temperatures, frozen alive to study frostbite. Others were infected with deadly pathogens, their symptoms meticulously recorded as they suffered. Some were subjected to vivisections without anesthesia, their organs removed while still conscious, all in the name of scientific observation. Limbs were amputated and reattached to the opposite side of the body, or removed to observe blood loss and infection. Pressure chambers crushed lungs. Centrifuges spun bodies until organs ruptured. And all of this occurred in sterile clinical rooms, laboratories where suffering was reduced to data, and death was merely an expected outcome. When World War II ended in 1945 and Japan surrendered, the truth about Unit 731 was hurriedly buried. Fearing exposure, the Japanese military ordered the complex to be destroyed. Buildings were burned, documents incinerated, and surviving scientists fled or were silenced. Yet despite their efforts, remnants of the facility remained. In the decades that followed, the ruins of Unit 731 sat abandoned on the outskirts of Harbin, shrouded in silence. Few dared to approach. The local population, aware of its dark history, spoke of ghosts and restless spirits haunting the decaying walls. Nature began to reclaim the site, with weeds and frost covering the broken concrete and rusting steel. But beneath the rubble, fragments of horror remained. When Chinese authorities eventually opened investigations in the 1980s and 1990s, they found disturbing evidence. Shattered glass chambers, surgical tables stained with rust and age, and fragments of experimental equipment still littered the underground rooms. Bone fragments, some human, some animal, were found buried in shallow graves. The labs that once housed deadly bacteria still carried traces of their dark past, though most of the biological agents had long since died out in the harsh winters. In one sealed chamber, investigators found records, partial logs of experiments, scribbled notes on infection rates, and cryptic diagrams of human anatomy. The notes, written in technical Japanese, were clinical in tone, devoid of empathy. To the scientists of Unit 731, Their victims were numbers, variables in a cruel equation. Some documents revealed the terrifying scale of their ambitions. Unit 731 was not just conducting isolated experiments, it was preparing weapons of biological warfare. Balloons carrying plague-infected fleas were planned to drift across enemy borders. Wells were to be poisoned with cholera. Entire cities, they hoped, could be silently wiped out by the invisible hand of disease. But perhaps the most unsettling legacy of Unit 731 is what happened to its architects. After the war, many of the leading scientists escaped justice. In exchange for their research data on biological warfare, some were secretly granted immunity by foreign powers who sought to gain an edge in the emerging Cold War. Instead of facing trial, they continued their careers in medicine, academia, and even government science programs. Today, part of the former Unit 731 site has been transformed into a museum, a chilling memorial to those who suffered and died within its walls. Visitors can walk through restored buildings, viewing surgical tools, photographs of victims, and the haunting remains of experiments long past. But much of the site remains closed, inaccessible to the public. Beneath the earth, sealed bunkers and forgotten rooms may still hide relics of the atrocities committed there. The abandoned sections of Unit 731 exude a cold, silent menace. Crumbling staircases descend into dark basements where only fragments of equipment remain. Laboratories, stripped of their contents, echo with emptiness. The wind howls through broken windows, as though carrying the voices of the forgotten. And there are rumors still. Some claim that hidden vaults, never recovered, contain samples of ancient pathogens, plague bacteria frozen in time, preserved in secret chambers. Others speak of classified documents that were never destroyed, detailing experiments too horrifying to disclose even now. Whether these stories are true or mere whispers of paranoia, one thing remains certain. Unit 731 stands as one of the darkest chapters in scientific history. It is a place where human life was discarded in the pursuit of power, where science was twisted into a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. The ruins near Harbin remind us of what happens when ethical boundaries are erased, and when curiosity is allowed to roam unchecked by conscience. Even today, the site feels wrong, as if the very ground remembers what took place there. And so the empty laboratories remain, their decaying walls holding the silence of the past, waiting for history to finally reckon with what happened inside. The abandoned NIH Monkey Lab, Maryland, USA. Hidden among the wooded suburbs of Poolesville, Maryland, lies a forgotten complex once buzzing with the sounds of life and the silence of scientific observation. This was the site of the NIH Monkey Research Facility, a place where some of the most advanced primate studies in the United States took place. For decades, it stood at the forefront of neuroscience, infectious disease research, and behavioral psychology. But today, the buildings sit empty and decaying, a ghostly monument to experiments long abandoned and lives long forgotten. The National Institutes of Health established the Poolesville Primate Facility in the late 1960s as part of the U.S. government's growing interest in biomedical research. Here, in isolated enclosures and sterile labs, hundreds of monkeys, primarily rhesus macaques, were housed and studied. Their purpose was both simple and complex: to better understand human biology by observing its closest genetic relatives. The research spanned countless fields. Scientists at the lab studied cognitive functions, aging, vision, and the effects of viral infections like HIV and herpes. Some projects explored psychological resilience, while others tested experimental vaccines. Monkeys were fitted with implants to monitor brain activity, exposed to controlled pathogens, and observed in isolation to measure the impact of stress. The facility itself was sprawling. Rows of long, low-slung buildings stretched across several acres, connected by narrow walkways and fenced enclosures. Inside, sterile laboratories housed surgical suites, MRI machines, and observation rooms where researchers spent countless hours recording behavior. Outside, concrete cages lined with steel bars gave the animals access to sunlight, though only in tightly controlled intervals. For a time, this facility was considered one of the premier primate research centers in the world. But by the 2010s, public sentiment toward animal testing began to shift dramatically. Animal rights groups launched campaigns against the use of primates in medical research, highlighting concerns over the animals' welfare and the ethics of the experiments. Under growing scrutiny, the NIH reviewed its practices. In 2015, after decades of operation, the NIH made a stunning announcement. It would begin phasing out invasive primate research. Monkeys at Poolesville were to be retired, rehomed to sanctuaries where possible, and the facility itself would be shut down. By 2019, most of the animals were gone, and the complex was left deserted. But what remained behind told a story of both scientific ambition and ethical debate. When the final staff left the buildings, much of the lab's infrastructure was simply abandoned. Inside the empty cages, worn feeding trays and enrichment toys lay scattered across the floors. In the laboratories, operating tables stood under dust-covered lights, their sterile surfaces cracked with age. Charts detailing primate family trees, behavioral patterns, and experimental timelines still clung to corkboards, curling at the edges. One of the most haunting sections of the complex was the isolation wing. Here, monkeys had once been kept in solitary chambers for months at a time, part of psychological resilience studies. The rooms were small, sterile, and eerily quiet. Even with the animals long gone, the oppressive atmosphere of loneliness lingered, as if the walls still remembered the suffering they had contained. In the biohazard areas, sealed freezers and containment cabinets once stored viral cultures and biological samples. Though emptied before the lab's closure, faint biohazard symbols still warned of the dangers that once lurked inside. Chemical showers and decontamination chambers stood silent, waiting for emergencies that would never come again. Scattered paperwork hinted at the scope of the work performed there. Detailed notes on behavioral experiments described tests of memory, fear conditioning, and social deprivation. Other records referenced vaccine trials against dangerous pathogens, research that, in many cases, contributed to life-saving treatments for human diseases. And yet, the controversy surrounding the lab could not be ignored. Former employees spoke of their conflicted feelings, of witnessing both the incredible intelligence of the primates and the harsh conditions of the experiments. Animal welfare advocates described a place of suffering hidden behind the veil of science, where creatures capable of joy and fear were reduced to data points and case studies. As the years passed, nature began to reclaim the NIH monkey lab. Weeds pushed through cracked pavement. Birds nested in the eaves. Rust spread across steel bars and door hinges. Urban explorers who ventured into the abandoned complex described an eerie stillness, interrupted only by the occasional creak of shifting metal in the wind. Despite its closure, the legacy of the Poolesville facility remains complicated. On one hand, the research conducted there advanced our understanding of diseases that affect millions. On the other, it raised uncomfortable questions about the moral cost of such knowledge. Can the suffering of one species ever be justified for the benefit of another? In recent years, some have called for the complete demolition of the site, hoping to erase its troubled past. Others argue it should be preserved as a reminder of both scientific achievement and ethical failure. For now, the buildings remain, forgotten by most, but remembered by those who once walked their sterile corridors. There are rumors, too, as there always are with places left behind. Some say that in the lower levels of the complex, sealed storage rooms still contain old experimental data, hard drives filled with behavioral footage, or unmarked containers holding biological samples. Others claim to have heard strange echoes at night, unexplained sounds from empty cages, or whispers carried through the ventilation shafts. Whether these stories are fact or folklore, the truth remains that the NIH Monkey Lab was once a place where science sought to unlock the mysteries of the mind and body, but where, in doing so, it walked dangerously close to the edge of compassion. Now, all that is left are empty rooms, rusting cages, and the fading traces of creatures whose lives were spent in the service of human understanding. The Fukushima Animal Testing Labs, Japan. When the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster struck in March 2011, the world's attention was drawn to the catastrophic failures at the power plant itself. The explosions, the radioactive leaks, the hurried evacuation of tens of thousands of residents. But farther inland, beyond the irradiated perimeter, hidden among the forests and rural farmlands, lay another kind of forgotten place. The Fukushima Animal Testing Labs, Japan. When the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster struck in March 2011, the world's attention was drawn to the catastrophic failures at the power plant itself. The explosions, the radioactive leaks, the hurried evacuation of tens of thousands of residents. But farther inland, beyond the irradiated perimeter, hidden among the forests and rural farmlands, lay another kind of forgotten place. Small, isolated animal testing laboratories that were quietly abandoned when the disaster unfolded. These labs were never intended to become sites of horror. In the years before the meltdown, they had operated as modest research facilities, studying agricultural animals, wildlife populations, and veterinary medicine. Some belonged to regional universities, others to private agricultural companies or government-backed research bodies. Their work ranged from vaccine development for livestock to environmental health studies, tracking the impact of pesticides and climate on native species. Before 2011, the surrounding region of Fukushima was known not only for its nuclear industry but also for its pastoral landscapes, dairy farms, rice fields, and vast forests where wildlife roamed freely. The animal labs were part of this ecosystem of rural science, performing quiet, unnoticed work far from the cities. But when the tsunami hit and the reactors melted down, everything changed overnight. The evacuation was swift and absolute. People left behind homes, farms, schools, and laboratories. Some researchers expected to return within days or weeks, once the radiation cleared. But as the severity of the contamination became clear, the exclusion zone hardened into a long-term no-man's land. The scientists never returned. The labs, like the villages and towns around them, were left to decay. When government inspectors and a few daring researchers ventured back into the zone months and years later, they found an eerie stillness hanging over the labs. In some cases, the power was still on, emergency generators humming quietly until they finally sputtered out. Equipment sat exactly as it had been left. Microscopes perched over glass slides, computers flashing error messages, lab notebooks open to the last unfinished entries. But the most unsettling discoveries were not the machines or paperwork. It was what had happened to the animals. In several animal testing facilities, the cages still held their occupants. Some had perished within days of the evacuation, unable to escape or survive without care. Others, more hauntingly, had found ways to break free. Broken cage doors, claw marks on the walls, and scattered food supplies told a fragmented story of struggle and escape. A few managed to roam the abandoned lab buildings, leaving behind a trail of chaos before disappearing into the surrounding wilderness. In the months following the disaster, wildlife in the exclusion zone flourished. With no humans to keep them in check, boars, monkeys, and even larger predators reclaimed the streets and forests. Among them were animals that had once been research subjects, feral dogs descended from laboratory specimens, or stray livestock released by farmers who had no choice but to flee. Some scientists returning to monitor the zone found pigs roaming wild, their descendants now completely feral, and cattle wandering through empty towns, their tags faded and unreadable. But what concerned biologists most were the subtle changes. Radiation levels in the zone remained dangerously high, and while many species seemed to thrive, there were reports of mutations. Birds with abnormal feathers, insects with shortened lifespans, and plant life with unexplained growth patterns. Whether these were the results of radiation exposure or simply the consequence of sudden ecosystem imbalance is still debated. Inside the animal labs, signs of the hasty evacuation were everywhere. Half-finished experiments on viral transmission in birds, unfinished dissections of local wildlife, and frozen samples left in powerless refrigeration units slowly thawed and decomposed. Some labs, unable to properly dispose of their biohazardous waste before fleeing, left behind containers marked with faded hazard symbols, their contents unknown but ominous. Perhaps the most disturbing find was in a basement storage room of one small veterinary lab. There, beneath layers of dust and decay, were shelves of preserved animal fetuses, cows, sheep, and pigs suspended in glass jars. Some appeared normal, but others showed deformities that might have been natural or experimental. Without the scientists to explain, the reasons for their preservation remain a mystery, locked in silence. Years later, When parts of the exclusion zone were partially reopened to scientific teams, the labs became sites of uneasy investigation. Researchers monitored radiation levels in surviving wildlife and tried to assess the long-term biological effects of exposure. Some studies were published, but others, citing inconclusive results or political sensitivity, never saw the light of day. Rumors began to circulate among the few who ventured deep into the restricted areas. Stories of strange animal sightings, creatures larger than they should be, with odd behaviors or physical anomalies. Tales of once domestic species now completely wild and unrecognizable, shaped by an environment hostile to human life. But the laboratories themselves remain largely untouched. Their walls, once places of learning and observation, now crumble in the humidity and the creeping mold. Equipment rusts, windows crack under the weight of time and weather. And in the quiet halls where the sounds of animal calls and human voices once mingled, there is only silence. There is something profoundly sad about these places. Unlike secret military facilities or dark experiments in forbidden science, these animal testing labs were intended to protect life, to improve agriculture, prevent disease, and safeguard the health of livestock and wildlife. Their abandonment was not born from cruelty but from disaster. And yet what was left behind, caged lives forgotten in the rush to escape, feels no less tragic. Today, the Fukushima animal testing labs stand as hidden scars on the landscape of the exclusion zone. Most remain off-limits, their structures too contaminated, too unstable, or too forgotten to justify restoration. Nature has begun to reclaim them, swallowing the ruins in vines and silence. But deep inside, the stories of what happened remain. The forgotten Naval Hospital Laboratory, France. Along the windswept shores of western France, tucked behind ancient stone walls and overlooking the gray Atlantic waters, stands the forgotten ruin of the Hôpital de la Marine, a once proud naval hospital whose legacy now crumbles beneath layers of dust and time. Few who walk past its ivy-covered facade realize what secrets once hid behind its weathered doors. For beyond its role as a hospital for wounded sailors and soldiers, this place housed a little-known medical laboratory where some of the earliest and most unsettling experiments in maritime medicine and battlefield surgery quietly took place. The hospital itself dates back to the early 1800s, a time when France's naval ambitions stretched across the globe. Injured seamen returning from faraway campaigns, some bearing wounds from cannon fire, tropical diseases, or frostbite from Arctic explorations, were treated here. But beneath the hospital's grand facade of whitewashed stone and arched windows, in the shadowy lower levels, a laboratory was established to support the ever-growing needs of military medicine. At first, the lab's work was simple, if vital, studying infections, preparing rudimentary antiseptics, and examining the spread of disease on cramped naval vessels. But as naval warfare evolved, so too did the urgency and ambition of the experiments. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the lab became a testing ground for experimental surgical techniques, battlefield wound treatment, and what we might now call early trauma research. The archives tell fragmented stories of amputations performed on cadavers and preserved limbs stored in formalin jars, of experiments with primitive anesthetics, some so crude that patients awoke mid-operation, of attempts to graft tissue from animal donors to human wounds, seeking ways to heal injuries sustained by cannon blasts or sword cuts at sea. Perhaps the most unsettling were the experiments aimed at understanding the effects of prolonged isolation at sea. In a time before modern psychology, the researchers of the Hôpital de la Marine studied sailors suffering from what they called melancholie de marins, a deep depression brought on by months of solitude and endless ocean horizons. To replicate these effects, some sailors and hospital patients were kept isolated in dark, soundless chambers, their mental states observed and recorded in cold, clinical detail. But as decades passed and medicine advanced, the laboratory's methods grew outdated, its funding diminished, and its reputation faded. By the 1950s, the lab was used only sporadically, reduced to a storeroom for old surgical equipment and forgotten medical texts. Then, sometime in the 1970s, the hospital closed its doors entirely. Advances in modern medicine, combined with changes in France's naval infrastructure, rendered it obsolete. Staff and patients left, and with them went the last caretakers of the hospital's forgotten lower levels. The laboratory was sealed and forgotten. For decades, the Hôpital de la Marine stood silent, battered by sea winds and storms. Few dared to enter. Locals spoke of strange noises from within, creaks and groans of ancient timbers, or perhaps something less easily explained. Legends grew, whispering of ghostly surgeons still performing their grisly work in the dead of night. When urban explorers finally entered the decaying hospital in the early 2000s, they found a world untouched by modern hands. Dust blanketed everything like a burial shroud. Along the laboratory walls, rows of shelves still held glass jars containing preserved human and animal organs, their faded labels written in elegant 19th century French script. Some jars had cracked with age, their contents long dried and shriveled. Others remained eerily intact, their cloudy fluids still holding what once were beating hearts, dissected lungs, or severed hands. The surgical rooms nearby were no less chilling. Rusted bone saws, scalpels, and clamps lay scattered across cracked marble counters. Ancient anatomy charts hung in tatters from the walls. In one corner, explorers found a leather-bound notebook, its yellowed pages filled with meticulous diagrams of surgical procedures, some familiar, others strangely experimental. One particularly haunting find was a series of iron restraints fixed to a long surgical table, suggesting that not all procedures performed here had been entirely consensual. Whether these were meant for restraint during surgery without anesthesia, or for something far darker, remains unknown. In a locked cabinet, explorers discovered rows of handwritten case studies describing failed grafting experiments, infections left untreated, and the slow psychological decline of isolated patients. Many of the names of the subjects were listed only by number, anonymous figures reduced to clinical observations. Beyond the laboratory, the hospital itself was a crumbling maze of forgotten wards and treatment rooms. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, illuminating rusting beds and tattered curtains. Old X-ray machines and abandoned medical equipment stood frozen in time, as though waiting for patients who would never return. Despite efforts by some preservationists to restore the site, the hospital remains closed to the public, deemed too dangerous due to structural decay and possible contamination from old medical chemicals still sealed in rusting cabinets. And yet, from time to time, rumors circulate of academic teams or paranormal investigators gaining secret access, hoping to uncover what official history has tried to forget. Some claim that deep within the lowest levels, sealed vaults contain medical samples so old they defy classification, ancient pathogens preserved in glass ampoules, or experimental drugs long banned by modern science. Others whisper of secret wartime experiments conducted during the early 20th century, when the hospital may have assisted in developing chemical warfare treatments or field surgeries for France's colonial campaigns. Today, the Hôpital de la Marine stands as a fading relic of medicine's uneasy past. Unlike modern research centers, where ethics committees and protocols guide every step, this place belongs to an era when the line between care and cruelty was often thin and blurred. And though the sea winds howl through its broken halls, though moss creeps along its walls and floorboards collapse beneath the weight of time, there is a sense that the hospital is not entirely empty, that somewhere beneath the surface of history, the echoes of surgeons, patients, and experiments gone wrong still linger in the shadows, waiting for curious souls to uncover them. Biosphere 2's abandoned research zones, in the heart of the Arizona desert, where the sun beats down on an ocean of red earth and scattered cacti, stands one of the most ambitious and enigmatic scientific experiments ever attempted. Known as Biosphere 2, it was a glass and steel monument to humanity's quest to understand life itself. Designed in the late 1980s, Biosphere 2 sought to be a self-contained miniature Earth, capable of sustaining life without outside influence. Yet beneath its gleaming exterior, hidden among its maze-like corridors and sealed research wings, are zones long abandoned, where early experiments failed, and where echoes of a forgotten scientific dream still linger in the air. Biosphere 2 was built as a grand experiment in closed ecological systems. The name itself implied a bold ambition. If Earth was Biosphere 1, then this would be the second, our first artificial world. Scientists, entrepreneurs, and dreamers hoped to simulate an environment where humans, animals, and plants could survive indefinitely, as they might one day do on distant planets. Inside, carefully crafted biomes replicated rainforests, deserts, oceans, and savannas. Teams of researchers, known as Biospherians, sealed themselves inside for months, surviving on the food they grew, recycling their air and water, and testing the limits of ecological balance. But reality, as it often does, proved more difficult than theory. Almost from the start, problems arose. Oxygen levels inside the structure dropped dangerously low. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated unpredictably. Some species thrived while others died off in unexpected ways. The closed systems, meant to be self-sustaining, proved fragile and prone to imbalance. And in the less publicized corners of the complex, experimental research areas, the abandoned zones of Biosphere 2 tell a quieter story of struggle and scientific mystery. These zones were not part of the public tours that later opened the facility to curious visitors. They were functional laboratories, maintenance tunnels, and isolated rooms where failed projects and forgotten equipment were left to gather dust. Some of these spaces were makeshift animal habitats, where small creatures like insects, reptiles, and amphibians were monitored for their role in maintaining ecological balance. Others were hydroponics labs, where crops grew under artificial light until sudden chemical imbalances wiped them out. In one of the lower chambers, far beneath the tropical rainforest dome, researchers attempted to cultivate rare fungi meant to recycle organic waste. The experiment worked, until an unexpected mold outbreak consumed the samples, forcing the entire zone to be sealed off and left to rot in the damp, artificial humidity. Today, it remains there, untouched, a hidden forest of invasive spores silently thriving in the dark. Elsewhere, there was an isolated aquaponics system designed to test the recycling of fish waste into plant fertilizer. For months, it worked perfectly, but then a sudden imbalance in pH killed the fish overnight, leaving the tanks eerily still. Rather than repopulate the system, the Biospherians sealed the room, focusing their energy on more pressing problems. The equipment remains, its once bubbling tanks silent and covered in algae. Perhaps the most unsettling research zone was the insect containment wing. Early in the mission, scientists introduced insects like cockroaches and katydids to serve ecological roles: pollination, decomposition, pest control. But within the closed system, without predators or environmental limits, some species exploded in number. Soon, the halls of Biosphere 2 were teeming with unchecked insect populations. The containment labs, filled with unused traps, breeding chambers, and discarded specimens, were eventually abandoned, the researchers unable to halt the infestation. And then there are the rumors, whispered among former staff and later visitors. Some say that, deep within Biosphere 2's labyrinthine corridors, certain research areas were sealed off not because of simple failures, but because of potential contamination. Unidentified microbial colonies, thriving in the stagnant water systems, developing resistance to antibiotics used within the biosphere. Whether these microbes posed a real threat or were simply abandoned due to logistical difficulties remains unclear, as few scientific papers ever documented them in detail. When the first mission ended and the SEAL teams finally stepped back into the outside world, the dream of Biosphere 2 as a self-sustaining colony collapsed. Financial struggles, scientific disagreements, and public scrutiny led to the project's decline. Ownership changed hands, and eventually the University of Arizona took control, repurposing the facility for environmental research. Many of the public biomes, the rainforest, the ocean, the desert, were restored and maintained, used for legitimate studies on climate change and plant ecology. But those forgotten zones remain, hidden behind locked doors and dark tunnels, off-limits to tourists and often too remote or degraded to justify restoration. Walk through the maintenance levels beneath the main domes, and you might hear the soft hum of ancient ventilation systems, still running after decades. Peer through a cracked window into one of the sealed labs, and you might glimpse rows of dormant machinery coated in dust, surrounded by the encroaching shadows of disuse. What makes Biosphere 2's abandoned research zones so haunting is that they were not places of cruelty or horror, but places of hope and failure. Scientists dreamed of creating a second Earth, a sanctuary where humanity could survive beyond the stars. Yet their ambitions collided with the unforgiving reality of complexity. Even the smallest error, a dead fish, a mold outbreak, an imbalance of carbon dioxide, was enough to disrupt the entire system. Today, Biosphere 2 is no longer sealed. Air flows freely through the glass walls, and human caretakers manage the delicate environments within. But the abandoned research zones remain untouched, quiet reminders of how difficult it is to control life, even within the most carefully engineered environments. They tell us that nature, even when recreated by human hands, resists control. That ecosystems, no matter how small, carry secrets and surprises far beyond our calculations. And that, sometimes, the most fascinating discoveries are found not in success, but in what we leave behind. And so, in the quiet corners of the Arizona desert, beneath glass and steel, the abandoned research zones of Biosphere 2 slumber on waiting, perhaps, for future explorers to unlock their forgotten mysteries once again. The Chicago Radiation Experiments Lab. Hidden deep within the industrial sprawl of mid-century Chicago, behind nondescript concrete walls and faded government signage, there once stood a laboratory whose quiet halls concealed some of the most ethically troubling experiments in American scientific history. Known unofficially as the Chicago Radiation Experiments Lab, this forgotten facility was a part of a vast network of Cold War-era research centers dedicated to understanding the effects of radiation on the human body. But unlike the more public-facing institutions of the atomic age, this lab operated in the shadows, its work classified, its subjects unaware. The story of the Chicago Radiation Lab begins during World War II, as the United States rushed to unlock the destructive power of the atom. The Manhattan Project brought the first self-sustaining nuclear reaction to life beneath the bleachers of the University of Chicago Stagfield. But while physicists celebrated their achievements, another question loomed quietly in the background. What would happen to human beings exposed to this new, invisible force? By the late 1940s, as the Cold War intensified, government agencies grew increasingly concerned about the biological effects of radiation, both on soldiers in future nuclear conflicts and on civilians in the event of accidents or attacks. Thus, in secret radiation biology labs were established across the country, and one of the most active among them was in Chicago. Officially, it was a clinical research facility affiliated with local universities and hospitals. Unofficially, it became the site of experiments that blurred the line between medicine and weaponization. Here, scientists, many of whom were prominent researchers of their day, conducted studies on the effects of radioactive isotopes injected directly into human subjects. The early experiments focused on unsuspecting patients. Cancer patients, hospital inpatients, and marginalized individuals were exposed to doses of plutonium, uranium, and polonium, not to cure them, but to observe how their bodies absorbed, metabolized, and excreted radioactive materials. Consent was rarely sought, and when it was often incomplete or misleading. The subjects believed they were receiving treatment. In reality, they were becoming data points in a national defense initiative. The lab itself was stark and utilitarian. Long, sterile corridors connected observation rooms to radiation chambers, where shielding devices and Geiger counters lined the walls. In some rooms, lead-shielded operating tables stood under heavy lighting, prepared for tissue biopsies and blood draws. Freezers held biological samples, blood, urine, organ tissues, collected from subjects after their exposure, carefully cataloged for long-term analysis. But the experiments extended beyond living subjects. Autopsies were performed on deceased patients who had unknowingly carried radioactive substances within their bodies. These post-mortem examinations allowed scientists to track the distribution of radioactive materials through bones, organs, and tissues, providing data that would shape nuclear safety protocols for decades to come. Records indicate that some experiments involved radioactive iron and calcium to study how these elements behaved within human metabolism. Others involved the inhalation or ingestion of radioactive aerosols, mimicking scenarios where soldiers might be exposed to fallout. In all cases, the goal was to quantify how radiation interacted with the body to prepare for an uncertain atomic future. As the years wore on, public awareness of nuclear risks grew. The horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by the mounting arms race with the Soviet Union, brought radiation's dangers into the global consciousness. Yet the work at the Chicago Radiation Lab remained hidden, classified under national security directives. It wasn't until the 1990s, decades after the Cold War had cooled, that investigative journalists and government inquiries began to reveal the extent of these experiments. Declassified documents painted a troubling picture of scientific ambition unchecked by ethical safeguards. Patients, many of them poor or marginalized, had been used as test subjects without proper consent. Families learned, often for the first time, that their loved ones had been part of secret government experiments. By then, the lab itself had long been shuttered. Budget cuts, shifting scientific priorities, and growing ethical concerns led to its quiet closure in the late 1970s. The building remained abandoned for years, a crumbling relic of a time when fear and curiosity drove science beyond moral boundaries. Urban explorers who later gained access described a facility frozen in time. File cabinets filled with yellowing patient charts, radiation suits hanging limp in storage rooms, and sealed radiation chambers still marked with faded hazard warnings. Geiger counters, long dormant, sat covered in dust, their needles frozen in place. In some corners of the lab, low levels of residual contamination were detected, a silent reminder of what once transpired there. Today, the site of the Chicago Radiation Experiments Lab has been redeveloped. Most of the original structures have been demolished, replaced by new buildings with no visible trace of what once stood there. But beneath the modern facades, beneath the sidewalks and foundations, the earth itself remembers. Trace amounts of radiation still linger in the soil, safely below hazardous thresholds but present nonetheless, a quiet ghost of the past. The legacy of the lab lives on in the reforms that followed. The revelations of the radiation experiments led to sweeping changes in human subject research ethics. The Belmont Report, the establishment of institutional review boards, IRBs, and federal regulations on informed consent were born from the recognition that science, no matter how urgent, must be grounded in respect for human dignity. And yet, the story of the Chicago Radiation Lab leaves lingering questions. How many discoveries are still hidden in classified archives? How many lives were altered in ways that remain undocumented? In our pursuit of knowledge, where do we draw the line between understanding and exploitation? Today, the story of the Chicago Radiation Experiments Lab stands as a quiet cautionary tale, a place where science reached beyond its ethical grasp, and where the pursuit of security eclipsed the very lives it was meant to protect. The lab is gone, its halls silent, its experiments ended. But the questions it raised remain, waiting in the shadows of history. Ghost Lab in Detroit's abandoned hospital. In the heart of Detroit, a city of faded grandeur and industrial ghosts, lies the crumbling shell of a once thriving medical center. Known in its heyday as one of the finest hospitals in the Midwest, this towering complex of brick and limestone was a symbol of hope, life, and healing. But as Detroit fell into economic ruin, so too did the hospital. Wards emptied, corridors fell silent, and deep within its forgotten research wings, a strange and unsettling laboratory remained, what locals would later call the Ghost Lab. The hospital itself dates back to the early 20th century, built during a time when Detroit's automobile industry was booming and the city's population surged. At its peak, the hospital housed thousands of patients and boasted cutting-edge research facilities. Doctors and scientists worked side by side, racing to cure diseases that ravaged the industrial working class: tuberculosis, polio, and countless workplace injuries. But behind the more well-known medical breakthroughs, in the hospital's lesser-known annexes and basements, a small group of researchers pursued something far stranger: an attempt to scientifically study what happens when life slips away. Unofficially known as the Consciousness Persistence Project, this research was born from a mix of medical science and spiritual curiosity. Its goal: to detect whether some measurable form of consciousness lingered in the body after clinical death. Inspired by early 20th century spiritualists and backed quietly by government grants curious about the mysteries of the human mind, this lab sought evidence of what lay beyond the veil. The Ghost Lab, as it came to be called, was located deep beneath the hospital's east wing. It was a stark, windowless series of rooms, One a clinical surgical suite, another a sealed observation chamber lined with primitive monitoring equipment, and yet another filled with reel-to-reel audio recorders and crude electromagnetic sensors. Researchers placed dying patients, many terminally ill and willing to volunteer, in these rooms during their final hours. Electroencephalograms monitored brain activity. Sensitive electromagnetic coils scanned for unexplained fluctuations. Microphones captured the near silence, waiting for anything that might indicate lingering consciousness. Weights measured the body before and after death, echoing older experiments that tried to detect the soul's departure. In some cases, the scientists recorded brief, puzzling phenomena. Sudden bursts of electromagnetic energy, faint electrical impulses milliseconds after brain death, or unexplained static patterns on their analog equipment. But their results were inconsistent, their interpretations murky. Was this lingering neural noise, a release of biological energy, or something more metaphysical? As funding dwindled and the scientific community distanced itself from such fringe research, the ghost lab faded from view. By the 1970s, the experiments had all but stopped. The equipment was left behind, gathering dust in the hospital's depths. Patient files, research notes, and reels of magnetic tape remained stacked on sagging shelves, forgotten as newer medical priorities took hold. Then came Detroit's collapse. As the auto industry faltered and the city's economy crumbled, the hospital fell into disrepair. Staff was laid off, entire wings were shut down, and eventually the hospital was closed for good in the 1990s. Its towering facade became another relic of Detroit's decline, visited only by urban explorers, graffiti artists, and the occasional scavenger. But those who ventured deep into the East Wing's lower levels spoke of something stranger. Urban explorers described cold spots in the air, malfunctioning electronics, and an eerie sense of being watched. Some claimed they heard faint voices through long-dead intercom systems. Others reported finding the lab itself remarkably preserved compared to the decayed hospital above. The surgical table still stood beneath a rusted overhead lamp. Shelves of reels and paper files remained, untouched except by time and mildew. Old radiation signs and hand-scrawled notes marked the observation room's walls. Perhaps most disturbing were the machines, long obsolete, but eerily intact. Oscilloscopes, Geiger counters, and magnetic tape players, some still humming faintly when explorers restored temporary power. On one cracked blackboard, the words Threshold Event Number 17, inconclusive, were written in faded chalk, as if the researchers had simply walked away mid-sentence. Locals soon wove these accounts into legend. The ghost lab, they said, was cursed. The hospital had become a place where death lingered longer than it should, where something had been disturbed that was never meant to be found. Paranormal investigators occasionally broke in, setting up modern EMF detectors and infrared cameras, chasing whispers of the afterlife where science once dared to tread. But no official research ever resumed. The medical journals never published the lab's findings. Whatever knowledge was gained remains locked away in those dusty files and warped magnetic tapes, which few have dared to recover. Today, the hospital's ruins stand in silent decay. Vines crawl up its crumbling walls. Wind howls through broken windows. Floors collapse under their own weight. And yet, far below, beneath layers of concrete and time, the ghost lab sleeps on. There are rumors that city redevelopment plans will one day demolish the hospital. But those who know the stories wonder, if they tear down the building, will they finally release what lingers within? Or will it simply scatter into the streets of Detroit, a restless echo of science reaching too far beyond its grasp? The ghost lab remains one of the city's most whispered secrets, a place where science and spirit collided in flickering lights and fading pulses, where researchers tried to measure the immeasurable, and where, perhaps, something measured them in return. Abandoned Viral Research Center, UK, tucked deep within a remote forest clearing, far from the bustling cities and watchful public eye, stands the decaying shell of the abandoned Viral Research Center, a place once dedicated to unraveling the secrets of humanity's deadliest microscopic enemies. Time has not been kind to this forgotten facility. Its walls are cracked, its hallways choked with dust and vines. But inside, traces of its past linger. Rusted containment chambers, faded warning signs, and sealed laboratories where viruses more dangerous than any weapon were once studied in eerie silence. The origins of the Viral Research Center stretch back to the Cold War era, when biological warfare cast a long shadow over scientific ambition. In those years of geopolitical paranoia, both East and West raced not only to develop nuclear arsenals, but also to master the invisible weapons of virology and bacteriology. Hidden behind layers of secrecy, governments built specialized laboratories where scientists toiled in isolation, searching for ways to weaponize or defend against the world's most lethal pathogens. This particular facility, located in an undisclosed part of Eastern Europe, was one such secret. Officially, it never existed. There were no public records of its construction, no open scientific publications bearing its name. But those who worked there knew its purpose well: to study hemorrhagic fevers, respiratory plagues, and neurological viruses, diseases capable of crippling entire populations. The facility itself was a marvel of its time, built beneath a camouflage of pine forests and rolling hills. Its reinforced concrete walls housed multiple containment levels, each stricter than the last. The outer wings contained administrative offices and basic laboratories for non-lethal strains, tests on influenza, adenoviruses, and agricultural blights. Deeper inside, behind secure airlocks and radiation shielding, were the high-containment labs, biosafety level 4 zones where only the most dangerous agents were handled. Researchers donned full-body positive pressure suits and passed through chemical showers just to enter. There, they worked with strains of Marburg virus, Ebola variants, engineered orthopoxviruses, and unclassified pathogens thought to have been isolated from deep Siberian tundras. Some viruses were natural. Others were modified, altered in small but terrifying ways to resist vaccines or spread more efficiently. Records recovered years later described chilling experiments. Animal trials designed to test airborne transmission. Environmental simulations replicating urban release scenarios. Countermeasure studies on antivirals that often failed before they could help. In many cases, the true purpose of the research was ambiguous. Did they seek to defend against biological threats, or to create them? But secrecy breeds isolation, and isolation breeds decay. By the late 1980s, as political tides shifted and Cold War tensions eased, funding for such clandestine research began to wane. Scientists left, supplies dwindled, and protocols fell into disrepair. Some rumors claim that a containment breach, whether large or small, hastened the center's closure. Others speak of internal dissent, scientists unwilling to continue work they had come to view as morally corrupt. By the early 1990s, the facility was abruptly evacuated. Some equipment was removed, but much was left behind, as if the researchers fled in haste. Autoclaves and centrifuges stood frozen in time. Incubators filled with sealed vials of unknown cultures remained plugged in until the power failed. Cabinets bore biohazard warnings in languages now faded by mold and moisture. For decades, the Viral Research Center sat undisturbed, watched only by the shifting forest around it. Nature began to reclaim the site. Tree roots cracked open pavement, vines crawled through broken vents, and rainwater seeped into containment chambers once thought impenetrable. Occasionally, locals spoke of strange happenings. Wildlife avoiding the area, or growing ill after straying too close. Strange smells carried on the wind. Flickering lights seen at night from beyond the treetops. Some whispered of unauthorized teams, whether government cleanup crews or independent scavengers, sneaking into the facility to retrieve samples, files, or experimental data. When journalists and independent researchers eventually ventured inside years later, what they found was haunting. Freezers labeled in code still held vials of unknown substances, some partially thawed after decades without power. Laboratory logs documented experiments whose details remain classified, describing viral strains unrecognized by any public scientific database. In one sealed observation chamber, cages still contained the skeletal remains of laboratory animals, untouched since the day the scientists left. In another room, sealed petri dishes had sprouted fungal blooms of unnatural colors, their origins uncertain. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a locked vault labeled only with the word "restricted." its electronic locks long dead, its contents sealed in darkness. To this day, no official reports confirm what was inside, though theories abound. Genetically engineered viruses, failed vaccine prototypes, or simply forgotten records of experiments too dangerous to ever see the light of day. Unlike many Cold War relics that were later declassified, the Viral Research Center remains a black hole in the public record. No government has claimed it. No scientific institution has taken responsibility. Its very location is left vague in most accounts, perhaps by design. Today, the abandoned complex stands as a testament to the dark side of human curiosity, a place where science and secrecy intertwined, where the quest to understand life's smallest forms of destruction nearly eclipsed our ability to control them. Nature, indifferent to human ambition, continues its slow reclamation of the site. Moss spreads across the lab benches. Birds nest in the ductwork. And in the lowest, darkest chambers, where sunlight never reaches, sealed vials of forgotten viruses may still lie in wait, their contents sleeping in cold glass. The abandoned Viral Research Center remains one of the most chilling reminders of what happens when fear, secrecy, and science collide. It asks a question that still haunts us today. In our race to protect humanity from biological threats, how far are we willing to go, and what are we willing to leave behind? And perhaps, somewhere beneath the earth, beneath layers of steel and concrete, the answers are still waiting. Secret Cold War chemical labs in Germany. Hidden behind dense pine forests and barbed wire fences in East Germany, long before the fall of the Berlin Wall, there stood a series of cold, gray buildings that never appeared on any civilian map. These were the secret Cold War chemical labs, places where science and secrecy blended into something far more dangerous. Shielded from public scrutiny and protected by the East German Stasi, these labs played a pivotal role in the covert arms race of chemical warfare, a silent struggle fought not with bombs or bullets, but with invisible poisons and choking gases. The origins of these labs trace back to the early 1950s, when the scars of World War II were still fresh and the new ideological conflict between East and West was rapidly escalating. The Soviet Union, determined to maintain technological superiority over NATO forces, ordered its satellite states to begin development of chemical and biological weapons programs in parallel with nuclear advancements. In East Germany, this directive led to the construction of hidden chemical research facilities deep within forested military zones and restricted industrial sectors. The most infamous of these labs was located near the town of Schönebeck, south of Magdeburg. Officially listed as a pesticide development plant, it was in fact one of the largest covert chemical weapons research centers in Eastern Europe. Behind its concrete walls, chemists, toxicologists, and military engineers worked on creating deadly nerve agents, incapacitating chemicals, and advanced delivery systems. Among the compounds studied were the notorious nerve agents, VX, sarin, and taboon, lethal substances capable of shutting down the human nervous system in minutes. But the labs also explored more insidious agents, chemicals that would disorient rather than kill, substances designed to manipulate the mind or cause temporary paralysis without leaving a trace. These were not only weapons of destruction but also tools of control. Rumors circulated among intelligence agencies that East German scientists experimented with psychoactive aerosols capable of disrupting enemy decision-making, or with skin-absorbed toxins that could incapacitate political targets without their awareness. Whether these substances were ever successfully deployed remains a matter of speculation. The labs operated under extreme secrecy. Scientists were recruited directly from East German universities and sworn to lifelong confidentiality. Many lived in isolated worker towns built specifically to service the chemical complex, separated from the outside world by fences and armed patrols. Family members were often left in the dark about the true nature of their loved ones' work. Inside the laboratories, safety was a secondary concern to secrecy. Accidents were frequent but rarely reported. Workers who fell ill were quietly removed from the facility and given cover stories about industrial mishaps. Protective gear was sometimes inadequate, especially in the early years, leading to chronic health problems among staff. Perhaps most chilling were the human experiments whispered to have taken place. Some defectors later claimed that the Stasi provided political prisoners and dissidents for chemical testing, though no concrete evidence has ever surfaced. If true, these tests would have been conducted in sealed chambers within the deepest parts of the complex, far beyond the reach of outside eyes. By the late 1980s, as the Cold War began to thaw and East Germany's economy crumbled, the chemical labs fell into disrepair. Funding dwindled, supplies became scarce, and some scientists defected to the West, bringing with them disturbing accounts of their work. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the regime collapsed, and these once-guarded secrets were left exposed. When reunified Germany sent investigators into the abandoned labs, they found a chilling scene. Chemical storage tanks still contained volatile residues. Crates of nerve agent precursors sat sealed but deteriorating. Laboratory notebooks filled with chemical formulas, test results, and cryptic annotations lined dust-covered shelves. Some rooms were found hastily evacuated, as if the staff had fled overnight. Coffee cups still on tables, experiments half completed. The most dangerous discovery was the incomplete stockpiles of weaponized agents. Some were buried in concrete bunkers on site, others transported to unknown locations in the chaos of the regime's fall. German authorities, assisted by international disarmament teams, spent years safely neutralizing these substances, but some fear not everything was accounted for. Today, the physical remnants of the secret Cold War chemical labs are slowly being reclaimed by nature. The main facility near Skånbeck was demolished, its ruins buried beneath layers of soil and new construction. But in more remote areas, crumbling outbuildings and rusted chemical storage drums still stand as silent witnesses to a forgotten arms race. Few public records remain. Much of the documentation was destroyed by fleeing officials, and what survived remains sealed in classified archives. Germany, like many nations with a troubled past, prefers to let some shadows fade quietly into history. But whispers persist. Some former lab employees, now elderly and living under new identities, have anonymously spoken of projects never completed. Chemical agents capable of altering human behavior, suppressing free will, or erasing memory. Whether these projects were science fiction or a few dangerous experiments away from reality is a question lost to history. The legacy of the secret Cold War chemical labs in Germany is one of ambition and fear, a reminder that during the Cold War, no weapon was too cruel to consider, no scientific frontier too dark to explore. And while nuclear bombs captured the world's attention, these silent laboratories toiled away on weapons meant to strike without warning, without fire, and without sound. Today, as Europe enjoys peace and unity, few visitors walking through the quiet forests of Saxony-Anhalt realize they tread upon ground where humanity once flirted with chemical catastrophe. Beneath their feet, buried by time and secrecy, lie the forgotten remnants of a war that was never fought, but always prepared for. Remote Arctic research stations, far beyond the reach of cities, beyond the forests and frozen rivers, where the world becomes an endless expanse of ice and silence, lie the remnants of the Arctic research stations. Built during the height of the Cold War and the space race, these isolated outposts in Russia and Canada were meant to be the cutting edge of scientific progress. But as global priorities shifted and harsh winters took their toll, many of these stations were left to decay, abandoned skeletons of glass and steel, surrounded by snowdrifts and the howling wind. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the Arctic was not only a geographical frontier but a scientific and strategic one. Both Soviet and Western powers sought to understand this hostile region. The poles were testing grounds for survival, resource extraction, and atmospheric science. But hidden among the studies of permafrost and auroras were darker undertones. Fears of biological outbreaks, ecological collapse, and the military potential of the far north. In Russia, these stations stretched from the Kola Peninsula to Chukotka, scattered across Siberia's vast, inhospitable landscape. Some were built to study natural phenomena like polar magnetism or glacial drift, but others were tasked with biological and chemical research, investigating how microbes survived extreme cold. Some of the most remote, like the station on Severnaya Zemlya, specialized in studying ancient bacteria trapped in permafrost, microorganisms frozen for tens of thousands of years. Canadian Arctic stations, meanwhile, were often funded as part of NORAD or international science programs. Places like Alert, Nunavut, the northernmost permanently inhabited place on Earth, and the Eureka weather station monitored climate patterns and radiation levels during the height of nuclear testing. But there were whispers of more classified experiments. Tests on biological resilience, pathogen survival in sub-zero conditions, and the detection of airborne contaminants drifting from global weapons tests. What made these stations so eerie was not just their isolation, but the strange findings they occasionally reported. Some Russian scientists claimed to have revived bacteria frozen in the ice since the Pleistocene, organisms with unknown properties. Others reported anomalies in the behavior of local wildlife, polar bears and seals displaying neurological symptoms inexplicable by environmental toxins alone. In both countries, contingency plans existed to turn these Arctic outposts into first response centers in the event of biological warfare. Their remoteness, once a burden, became an asset. Isolated testing zones, far from civilian populations. But this also meant that accidents, should they occur, would go unnoticed for weeks, perhaps months. As the Cold War thawed and funding dried up in the late 20th century, many stations were abruptly abandoned. Researchers were pulled out by helicopter before full decontamination procedures could be completed. Generators were switched off, leaving laboratories and dormitories to freeze over. Experimental samples, vials of unknown biological cultures, and sealed storage units remained where they were last left. When modern explorers, scientists, adventurers, or journalists ventured into these stations decades later, they found scenes frozen in time. Laboratories still held petri dishes with frostbitten colonies. Refrigerators, thawed and refrozen countless times, contained test tubes marked only with Cyrillic or cryptic serial numbers. Radiation shielding lay cracked on floors, and Geiger counters blinked in the dim Arctic twilight. In some Russian stations, faded hazard symbols warned against opening certain vaults sealed beneath layers of ice. In Canada, the remains were less sinister but no less haunting. Broken weather instruments lay buried under snow. Research logs from the 1960s spoke of unusual solar flare activity or unexplained magnetic disturbances, and hinted at data that was never fully analyzed before operations ceased. And always the cold. Windows frosted over, doors frozen shut, and machines entombed in layers of ice. Human footprints long since erased by snowstorms. No sign of hasty evacuation, only the quiet abandonment of a forgotten frontier. Modern scientists remain intrigued by what might still be locked away in these permafrost vaults. Recent studies in both Russia and Canada have confirmed that ancient viruses, frozen for millennia, can revive when thawed. Though most are harmless to humans, the possibility remains that some unknown pathogen sleeps beneath the ice, waiting for the next melt. Climate change, now melting the Arctic at an unprecedented rate, has made these abandoned labs even more concerning. As permafrost thaws, sealed storage units from Cold War-era research risk exposure. Some have already been recovered by environmental teams. Others, in more remote locations, remain inaccessible. Governments rarely speak of these stations today. Many were too small, too obscure to warrant public interest. Some were quietly dismantled, their contents buried or incinerated. But in the emptiest corners of the polar world, where the sun disappears for months and night falls like a curtain, the remains of these cold laboratories still stand, rusted steel frames against the pale horizon. They are reminders of a time when science and politics collided on the edge of the world, when isolation was used both for safety and secrecy, and when humanity looked into the frozen void, searching for knowledge, but sometimes found only questions. And so the remote Arctic research stations endure, silent and still, as the wind whispers through their hollow corridors and the ice slowly reclaims what we left behind. The Animal Mutation Facility in Kazakhstan. In the endless steppes of Kazakhstan, where the wind sweeps across barren plains and forgotten military outposts crumble beneath the sky, there once existed a facility whose very purpose remains shrouded in secrecy. Known only through fragmented testimonies and declassified fragments of Cold War documents, the Animal Mutation Facility was a place where nature itself was tampered with in pursuit of biological understanding and perhaps control. Built during the 1950s in the shadows of the Soviet Union's sprawling weapons complexes, this isolated laboratory was hidden near the Semipalatinsk test site, where hundreds of nuclear detonations had already scarred the Earth. But while Semipalatinsk was devoted to atomic power, the animal mutation facility, located several kilometers away and buried beneath earthworks and camouflage nets, focused on the biological aftermath, studying how radiation, chemical agents, and genetic manipulation could alter living organisms. Its origins were pragmatic and chilling. Soviet scientists feared that nuclear war would contaminate entire ecosystems, and they needed to know how animals, and eventually humans, might adapt to such devastation. But beyond defense, there was a darker ambition. Could animals be engineered to survive, resist, or even thrive in post-nuclear environments? And if so, could these creatures be weaponized? The facility's design was utilitarian, resembling a series of low concrete bunkers partially submerged in the ground. Surrounding it were open-air enclosures and underground pens where countless test animals lived, bred, and were subjected to continuous experimentation. The surrounding steppes, once home to grazing livestock, became zones of controlled contamination. Inside, Soviet geneticists, biologists, and military medical officers worked with a variety of species: rabbits, goats, dogs, birds, and rodents. These animals were exposed to low-dose radiation, mutagenic chemicals, and viral agents to observe changes in physiology, reproduction, and behavior. Some creatures survived multiple generations in the harsh environment, their offspring carrying strange deformities and unexplained traits. Declassified reports describe some of the mutations observed. Rabbits born hairless but with thickened, scar-like skin resistant to sunburn and frostbite. Rodents whose bone density increased far beyond normal, making them abnormally heavy for their size. Dogs that developed heightened aggression and resistance to sedatives, making them difficult to control. Birds whose plumage grew in patchy, unnatural colors, possibly due to pigment gene disruption. Perhaps the most disturbing were rumors of cross-species experiments, early attempts at gene splicing using crude techniques. Though modern science would dismiss these as folklore or misunderstanding, some Soviet defectors spoke of small, short-lived creatures bearing traits of multiple animals, born in the facility's underground labs and quietly disposed of when they failed to survive. The facility operated for decades with little oversight from outside Soviet scientific circles. Workers lived in isolated barracks, their families never knowing the full extent of their work. Safety protocols were primitive by today's standards. Chemical spills, accidental exposure to radiation, and the escape of contaminated animals were not uncommon. The local wildlife, too, began to show strange traits. Wolves with missing eyes, cattle born with extra limbs, and birds incapable of flight. As the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, the facility was abruptly abandoned. Scientists fled or were reassigned. Equipment was left behind, and some of the test animals were simply released into the wild. The buildings, no longer guarded, fell prey to scavengers and the harsh Kazakh climate. Wind and dust swept through the open enclosures, covering forgotten cages and shattered glass. When independent researchers and journalists finally gained access years later, what they found was both fascinating and unsettling. The laboratories remained in eerie disarray. Syringes, surgical tools, and decayed specimen jars lay scattered across examination tables. Faded posters of animal anatomy and Soviet propaganda still clung to the peeling walls. In the outdoor pens, bones and remains of long-dead test animals were discovered, some bearing mutations inconsistent with natural causes. Geiger counters clicked softly over the soil, registering residual radiation from nearby tests. Old, water-damaged ledgers listed cryptic project titles: Project Redfong, Experiment Z4C, Long-Term Cold Resistance Trials, with no further explanation. But perhaps the most haunting discovery was the complete absence of certain records. Key documents, including the results of the most extreme genetic experiments, were missing. Some speculate they were destroyed during the Soviet collapse. Others believe they were smuggled out and remain hidden in undisclosed archives or foreign hands. Local legends grew in the facility's wake. Shepherds spoke of strange animals spotted on the steppes, creatures resembling wolves but walking upright, or hares with glowing eyes that watched from the scrub. Whether these were exaggerations, misidentifications, or remnants of escaped experiments remains unknown. Today, the animal mutation facility is a rusting ruin, reclaimed by the vast emptiness of the Kazakh plains. Its cracked concrete walls are home to nesting birds and burrowing rodents. The wind whistles through broken ventilation shafts, carrying with it the faint scent of chemicals and dust. Few dare to approach, fearing lingering contamination or something worse. International biological hazard teams have surveyed the area sporadically but concluded that the immediate threat has passed. Yet the deeper mystery of what truly happened inside those bunkers remains unsolved. Did these experiments contribute anything meaningful to science? Or were they simply a misguided chapter of Cold War paranoia? Did any of the modified animals survive beyond the lab, blending into the wild, carrying their mutations into future generations? These are questions that no government has fully answered. The animal mutation facility in Kazakhstan stands today as a chilling reminder of an era when science was driven not by curiosity alone, but by fear. A place where life was altered in ways nature never intended, and where the consequences of human ambition remain buried beneath the steppe, waiting to be unearthed once again. Ending. And now, I want to ask you, which of these forgotten laboratories gave you chills? Was it the Soviet bioweapons hidden on a distant island, the eerie silence of an Arctic station, or the strange experiments deep in the forests of Germany? Tell me in the comments below what fascinated you the most, and what disturbed you the most. And if you enjoyed this quiet journey through the shadows of science, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries as much as you do. There are many more hidden places waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious and sleep well.